archive stays open until 3 p.m. or email joe@rte.ie.
Hello there. You're very welcome to Rattlebag. On today's programme, the creator of an entire parallel universe. We talk to the author of the Discworld novels, Terry Pratchett. 1850-715-105 is our telephone number. Now, when Terry Pratchett began writing his first Discworld novel, The Colour of Magic, he probably had no idea quite what he was starting. He's now sold 40 million of his novels set in this fantasy parallel universe, and he's written for children as well as adults, and has won the prestigious Carnegie Medal for The Amazing Morris and His Educated Rodents. However, it's his Discworld novels for adults which have garnered him most sales and most devotion. The world rotates on the backs of 4 giant elephants supported by a flying turtle, and has inspired theatre adaptations, computer games, role-playing, soap sets, seminars, and high levels of devotion. As I said, and Terry Pratchett joins me now from a studio in Eastbourne to talk about his latest Discworld novel, Thud. Terry, I've lost count. What number is Thud in the series?
Well, I consider that the children's Discworld books are part of the series, so it's the 34th.
And you've got to read a little bit from it first. You've got an extract which I think involves pole dancing.
Yes. Oh, you'd like that one, do you?
We'll start with that.
That is one of my favourite ones, to be frank. I have to say that Sergeant Colon and Corporal Nobby Nobbs are 2 of the worst, scruffiest policemen in Ankh-Morpork, and there's a little discussion about Nobby Nobbs's romantic life. You know, when you was on your day off last week, said Sergeant Nobbs, well, me and Constable Jolson got into the Pink Pussycat Club, Nobby. You know, there's pole dancing and table dancing and stuff of that nature. And you know old Mrs. Spudding, what lives in New Cobblers? Oh, old Mrs. Spudding with the wooden teeth, Sergeant, said Nobby. The very same, Nobby, said Colon, magisterially. She does the cleaning in there, and it appears that when she come in at 8 o'clock in the morning a.m., with no one else about, Nobby, well, I hardly like to say this, but it appears she took it into her head to have a twirl on the pole. They shared a moment of silence as Nobby ran this image in the cinema of his imagination and hastily consigned much of it to the cutting-room floor. But she must be 75, Sarge, he said, staring at nothing, in fascinated horror. A girl can dream, Nobby, a girl can dream, said Fred Colon. Of course, she forgot she wasn't as limber as she used to be, plus she got her foot caught in her long drawers and panicked when her dress fell over her head, and she was in a bad way when the manager came in, having been upside down for 3 hours with her false teeth falling out on the floor. Wouldn't let go of the pole, too. Not a pretty sight. I trust I do not have to draw you a picture. Come to finish, Precious Jolson had to rip the pole out, and we slid her off. That girl's got the muscles of a troll, Nobby, I'll swear. And then, Nobby, when we was bringing her around behind the scenes, this young lady wearing 2 sequins and a bootlace comes up and says she's a friend of yours. I did not know where to put my face. You're not supposed to put it anywhere, Sarge. They throw you out for that sort of thing, said Nobby.
Okay, I think that people will get the idea that Ankh-Morpork is actually not that radically different from, any major city in the real world as opposed to the Discworld, except perhaps it doesn't have trolls, it doesn't have dwarves, and it doesn't, it's not a world supported by 4 elephants and a turtle. What kind of imagination do you think creates a world supported by 4 elephants and a turtle and is flat?
I think it's a fair... Well, first of all, that actual description of the world can be found in many mythologies on the planet and comes to its finest fruition, I think, in Hindu mythology. So all I really had to do was borrow the image. As for the civilizations on the back of it, I suppose the best way of describing them is Middle Earth 500 years later. The wars are over, commerce has taken the place of battle, and everyone has come out of the hobbit holes and down from the hills and up from the dwarf mines, and they're just trying to make an honest dollar in the big city.
And the big city is let's face it, from reading your own descriptions of it, a fairly disgusting place. It's dirty, it's dank, it's everything. It's built on layer upon layer upon layer.
Oh, indeed. In fact, like an awful lot of European cities, I would have to say. But it's vibrant. It has a strong commercial life. I mean, it's thriving. It's a cross between, I suppose, Georgian London and New York in the 1850s. You know, there's everyone scrambling for a dollar.
Is it the kind of place where people would still throw the contents of a commode out the front out the window into the street, onto the street below?
Yes, but they would ask you to get out of the way first.
That's civilized.
Oh, yes, that's polite.
Yeah, you have a copy with you, I think, of one of the earlier books in the Discworld series, and that's Mort. And Mort is somebody who is basically an apprentice to death. He gets hired at a hiring fair. He's really the only person left. Mm-hmm. Everybody else has been hired in this hiring fair. But you have a wonderful description of this capital city of this part of Discworld, Ankh-Morpork, which I think will get the idea across about the place that we're talking about. Perhaps you'd read that first if you have it with you.
Okie dokie. Poets have tried to describe Ankh-Morpork. They have failed. Perhaps it's the sheer zestful vitality of the place, or maybe it's just that a city with 1 million inhabitants and no sewers is rather robust for poets who prefer daffodils, and no wonder. So let's just say that Ankh-Morpork is as full of life as an old cheese on a hot day, as loud as a curse in a cathedral, as bright as an oil stick, as colourful as a bruise, and as full of activity, industry, bustle, and sheer exuberant busyness as a dead dog on an ant-hill. There were temples with their doors wide open, filling the streets with the sounds of gongs, cymbals, and in the case of some of the more conservative fundamentalist religions, the brief screams of the victims. There were shops whose strange wares spilled out onto the pavement. There seemed to be rather a lot of friendly young ladies who couldn't afford many clothes. There were flares and jugglers and assorted sellers of instant transcendence. And death stalked through them all. Mort had half expected him to pass through the crowds like smoke. But it wasn't like that at all. The simple truth was that wherever death walked, people just drifted out of the way.
I want to get an idea of the imagination and the background of the person who has created this amazing world, which has brought so much pleasure to so many people, and as I said, has sold 40 million copies.
I have to tell you, it's 45 now.
45 million copies.
We found some more.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that they sell so fast that by the time you actually type it out, they've probably sold another 1 million copies. You published your first story when you were 15 years old. Now, published, not just wrote, published your first story. Do you remember what it was about?
Yes, it was. I actually wrote it when I was 13. It was a nice little story about how the devil, realizing that no one's coming to hell anymore, hires what we would call now a spin doctor. I was well ahead of my time, and the guy has a look around and realizes that what people would dread to have to experience for all eternity, they will actually be very willing to pay £10 for to experience for about 3 minutes. And in fact, hell is turned into an amusement park and becomes incredibly popular. I actually wrote that, and it appeared in my school magazine, and the headmaster disapproved of it, but all the kids loved it. So
That's a good sign.
I bribed my aunt with a bunch of flowers because she had a typewriter, and she typed it out for me, and I sent it off to a professional magazine, and they accepted it. And they paid me £14, which in those days was just enough money for me to buy a second-hand typewriter.
I thought you were going to say a second-hand car there for a minute, but I know
it wasn't quite that long ago. But that was it. Then I was at that most dangerous thing, an adolescent with a keyboard, and I knew how to use it.
Yeah, you did what a lot of very good professional writers have done over the years. You actually left school relatively early, and you worked in a local newspaper. Mm-hmm. Is it true? Because it says it in your image, like The Colour of Magic, which is the first of the Discworld novels, and it says Terry Pratchett was born in 1948 and is still not dead.
That's true.
That's absolutely, we hope so. He started work as a journalist one day in 1965 and saw his first corpse 3 hours later. Work experience meaning something in those days.
Yes.
That is actually true?
Totally true. We would have been doing double geography at the time. And one of the things I learned 3 things actually. It was a body fished out of a pond, and it had been in there for some time. I learned 3 things: that this was a lot more interesting than double geography. I learned that a corpse can go some very strange colours after death, and I learned that it's quite possible to go on being sick even though you've run out of anything to be sick with.
And you have put certainly the latter to very good use in your writing ever since, given some of the things that you've described in your novels. I mean, what kind of stories did you cover when you were a junior reporter? I mean, obviously we've had an example of one of them, the earliest of them. And what effect do you think that they had on your later writing?
Well, I think you really answered the question for me. That there is no better training for a writer, any kind of writer, than to do a stint on a small newspaper. I say small newspaper because that means fairly early on you'll get to cover big stories, and whether they're murders, suicides, you'll do the inquests, you'll do the court cases, you'll do the local council meetings. You'll get an entry into all sorts of walks of life, and you'll meet people in unusual situations. You get to see a lot of life all packaged neatly for you, just because you've got a notebook and a pen.
Did you cover many murders? 2.
It's a fairly quiet place. But the most curious things were were the coroner's courts, ascertaining causes of death and things like that. But you never knew, because I had my patch. I would cover anything that came up in that patch, once I'd got trained, and you never knew what tomorrow was going to bring.
And did you come across many bizarre or even dangerous characters while working on newspapers? Oh,
yes. One used to appear very, very regularly in police court. And of course I had to report the cases, and he lived very, very close to me as well.
And he knew where you lived.
And he knew where I lived, so I used to go home sort of the back way. But yes, I remember once walking down the street with an elderly reporter who was about to retire, and I said, "Didn't you find it a bit dull just reporting the events of a small town?" And he said, "Well, no." He said, "Of course I couldn't write it all down, but you see that house up there? That was the house where the girl was locked in the attic for having the 2-headed baby. And see that house? That was where the man lived who was caught in flagrante delicto with a common barnyard fowl. And his defence in court was, well, it was my hen." And then he went down the street, and the way he described it, he lived, in a town that should have been run by the Sodom and Gomorrah Urban District Council. And I can't pretend I came up with things like that, but it's amazing the stories that there are behind the net curtains.
So you don't entirely, when you then came to becoming a best-selling author, you didn't entirely have to use your imagination. You could go back to experience for some of it, at least.
Well, for some of it, I actually wrote a book called The Truth, which is about the first newspaper on Discworld, which starts in Ankh-Morpork, and I included all the things that as young reporters we have to deal with, and they were straight from my experience, the drunken steeplejack who's threatening to commit suicide and wants to talk to a man from the newspaper, so you have to climb this ladder, this swaying ladder in the wind to talk to him. And then, of course, there's the humorous-shaped potatoes. I don't know whether they're how popular these have been in Irish newspapers, but we knew that as soon as the potato season started, someone would come in and say, "See this potato? Isn't it funny? It looks just like Winston Churchill." And you absolutely knew that you should not put this in the paper, because if you did, the front office on Friday morning would be full of other old boys, all with bags holding very, very humorous potatoes. And they all looked like Winston Churchill. And it seemed to me the weirdest thing wasn't that potatoes actually looked like Winston Churchill. It was that the British had actually voted for a prime minister who looked like a vegetable.
Yeah, I mean, you'd never get a potato that looked like Anthony Eden, for example.
No, but do not let us get started on the humorously obscene carrots.
Yeah,
because I think you're with me here.
I think we might draw a veil over that one. Yeah. I think we leave that to people's imagination.
But the thing, most of what you might call the motor behind Discworld is, believe it or not, lack of imagination. taking things seriously. If you take... They're the things that we agree not to think too deeply about, and if you do start applying some logic to them, they become funny. Now, here's one, because it was something that I read recently. The Norse goddess Freya is often depicted as riding in a chariot pulled by 200 cats. And I read that. We've got 6 cats at home, and I thought, I don't actually think you're going to make 2 cats go in the same direction at the same time. This is 200. Okay, she was a goddess, but 200 cats, 1 goddess, no contest. And yet, for years and years, this has been passed on, and you think, you know, did anyone actually look at what happens when you tie cats to other cats? It's not a pretty sight. And there are other things.
Hold on just a minute. I want to talk to you a little bit more about those kind of sources of inspiration for the discourse, but we have to take a break at this stage. Terry, stay with us, if you would. Terry Pratchett on the line there from Eastbourne. We'll have more from Terry after the break, but now it's time for news read by Anne Doyle.
Good afternoon. The Central Criminal Court in Dublin has jailed a 28-year-old man for life after hearing evidence that he stabbed a man at least 8 times and jumped on his head. David O'Brien from Limerick pleaded guilty to the murder of Martin Murray, aged 38, at Mill Lane in Drogheda in August last year. O'Brien attacked Mr Murray after finding him in his apartment with his girlfriend. The former Fine Gael Senator Liam Cosgrave has pleaded guilty at the Dublin Circuit Criminal Court to making a false or misleading report of a political donation. He failed to declare that he received a single donation exceeding £500 Irish in 1997. Cosgrave, who's 49, with an address in Merrion Park, Blackrock, County Dublin, is son of the former Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave. Sentencing was adjourned until February next year. CIE has confirmed that it's seeking an increase in fares on bus and rail services from January. The company said it was in negotiations with the government. CIE didn't give a figure, but said it wasn't as much as the 10% quoted in newspapers. The company blamed rising costs, including fuel, for the move. Helicopters carrying emergency supplies have resumed flying missions to remote areas in northern Pakistan, devastated by the recent earthquake. The flights had been grounded by poor weather over the weekend. Relief workers are warning that thousands could die in the next few days if they don't get shelter and urgent medical attention. Kerry County Council has voted to hold a plebiscite to decide whether or not the name of the West Kerry town on Dangan should be changed to a bilingual form, Dingle Dangany Huish. The name of the town was controversially changed last March as a result of the Place Names Order of the Official Languages Act. However, the move sparked a campaign to change the town's name to a bilingual form. No date has been fixed for the plebiscite. And that's the news.
RTE weather on Radio 1 with Dimplex Home Heating, keeping you warm at home, whatever the weather.
Dry with some hazy sunshine in the north and east, but overcast and wet conditions in Munster will gradually become more widespread. And those are the headlines. News again at 4.
11, 811. If you need a number when you're out in the town, we'll text it to you, no need to write it down. Air comes 11811.
Call 11811 from your mobile and we'll text back the number for free. 11811 for any number you need nationwide. Directory inquiry service charges apply. For more information, call 18904 11811.
Air comes 11811.
The National Council for Special Education is working nationally and locally to provide a better special education service for children with disabilities. We're currently preparing an implementation plan for the Education for Persons with Special Educational Needs Act. If you want to make a submission, contact us on 046 948 6400 or visit ncse.ie. The National Council for Special Education, working to deliver a better special education service.
Now you can watch Telly Bingo at lunchtime every Tuesday and Friday. The TV show starts at 12:45 p.m. on RTE1, so remember to buy your ticket before 11 a.m. Watch Telly Bingo at lunchtime every Tuesday and Friday on RTE1.
Welcome back. You're listening to Rattlebag. 1850 715 105 is our telephone number. We'd like to hear from you, particularly if you were a fan of Terry Pratchett and the Discworld novels. And before we go back to talking to Terry, just to remind listeners who have tickets for our public interview with Alan Bennett, which takes place in the Samuel Beckett Theatre in Trinity College tomorrow night, starting at 7 o'clock sharp. There's been an absolutely huge response to this event. And we've got a waiting list of people who would love to attend. So please, if you've got tickets and you can't make it, will you please ring us on Dublin 208 2822 01 208 2822 or email rattle@rte.ie, because there are people who would love to get hold of those tickets. And I just want to mention that Bret Easton Ellis, whose new novel Lunar Park has just been published, will also be in Trinity College tomorrow night. He'll be the Edmund Burke Theatre, and you can get tickets for that occasion from Easton's in Dawson Street. The number 01677 1255, and Bret Easton Ellis will be in the Rattlebag studio on Wednesday to talk about the book. But back to Eastbourne and to Terry Pratchett. Terry, tell me, why was your first book, which wasn't a Discworld book, why was it launched in the carpet department of a store, a big store on Tottenham Court Road?
Oh, that was the carpet people, and you've done some very good research. Yeah, it was a kind of a fantasy adventure set in a carpet with tiny creatures, and I don't know, I think my publisher got together with Heels and we launched it in a carpet department. What more can I say?
An excellent idea. And how big a fan of science fiction and of fantasy were you when you got the idea for the Discworld novels? Were you somebody who'd been reading them since you were 5 years old?
Actually no, I didn't start reading until I was about 10.
You didn't start reading, period?
Yeah, I mean, well, you read at school because it was what you did at school, but my school wasn't very good at inculcating the idea that reading was something you could do for fun. So when I discovered it around 10 years old, suddenly I would read absolutely everything. And so I read books for kids, books for adults. No one really kind of explained to me that there was meant to be a difference. I mean, obviously the ones about the bunny, you know, that have been chewed in the corners, I understood they were for kids. But there was kind of no upper limit. Some of them baffled me a bit, but I persevered, and I absolutely read everything I could lay my hands on. Fantasy and science fiction is very good for getting kids reading, and that certainly happened as far as I was concerned. But it was fairly soon I realised that, you know, it wasn't a very big science fiction section in my local library, but astronomy was nearly as good, and paleontology was nearly as good. You know, monsters in other worlds. Here's monsters that were on this planet. And then I read, I finished all the fantasy, so there was the folklore, which is kind of a bit like fantasy, and then there was the mythology, which is a bit like fantasy, but it's a bit posher, and then there was ancient history, which is a bit like fantasy, but it was real. And so I kind of got an education in the library, but it was the science fiction and fantasy shelves that got it started.
Now, when you started writing the Discworld series, you added an extra element to science fiction and fantasy, which most people who don't particularly like those genres see as being singularly absent, and that's the element of humour. Was that because you are happier as a humorous writer, or were you intending to send up some of the worst excesses of those genres?
Well, I'm happier as a humorous writer, but let's face it, in the classical fantasy universe, there is absolutely so much that you can send up, and I started off, I suppose, by sending up. It's hard to yes, there are quite a lot of worst excesses of fantasy, probably some of them being created by me by now. But I started off by sending up fantasy in a kind of friendly way, but now the Discworld books pretty much send up everything in the world.
Well, this is it. That's something I want to come to, because they have changed over the year. I mean, years. I mean, Thud is a very different kind of novel to The Colour of Magic, which was the first in the series. But did you always intend it to be a series when you started? Did you have any idea at all of what was going to happen?
When I wrote the first book, I wasn't even certain there was going to be a second book. No, I had no idea at all. It was just something that I was doing for fun. I would have been incredibly amazed even to think that I would make money out of writing, let alone a living.
And do you remember where you got the idea for the first Discworld novel, for The Colour of Magic, and how you developed it?
That's so far back in the mists of time, but I think there was it was a story in the Arabian Nights called Appointment in Samara. You may have heard about it, where a servant comes to his master and says, "Master, can you lend me a very fast horse?" And when the man asks why, the servant says, "When I was in the marketplace, death jostled me. And when I looked at him, he looked as if he was expecting to see me. And so therefore, can you lend me a very fast horse, and I will ride all night to the city of Samara, where he won't think of looking for me." And the merchant did this, and then he too went down to the marketplace, where he saw Death. And he said, why did you surprise my servant? And Death said, "I didn't intend to, but I was rather astonished to see him here, because I have an appointment with him tomorrow in Samara." And it's a nice little tale anyway, and it kind of introduced Death as a character in ways that as a kid I wasn't familiar with, and that stuck in my mind for a very long time. And in fact now Death, the Death of Discworld, who's actually not particularly an unpleasant kind of guy, is a favourite character in the series.
And how do you think it has changed since the 1980s? I mean, do you think it more closely parallels events in the real world now?
Painfully closely sometimes, and not necessarily of my doing. I write the thing, and then later on the real world catches up. Yeah, I think one of the things is I've got older, and the other thing is that while the books are humorous, and I like writing humour, you have to have more than humour to carry the book. You really do. You have to be able to have a plot. You have to have some darkness so that the light shows up. So, maybe sometimes someone has to die, blood has to be spilled, there must be some tragedy, because without the tragedy you don't get the comic relief.
But do you think that they've become more commentary and satire?
People say that, and I suppose they have slipped into satire, and it's hard to know where parody ends and satire finishes sometimes. But I suppose, I live in this world, and I see the news, and I think about what I see, and in curious ways it ends up in Discworld. I mean, Discworld we talk of it as a fantasy city, but despite the fact it has no steam and electricity, it has lots of inventive people. I mean, it is a fantasy city, but it has got a condom factory, and you will not find one of those in Middle-earth. And shame on you for looking.
This is true. Tolkien never got round to that, did he? I want to get you to read another bit of Thud, and I defy anybody when they hear you reading this not to think about a certain date in the middle of July, and a celebration of a certain event which took place in County Meath in 1690. I'm not sure that that's necessarily your intention, but it may have been a peripheral intention. This is Coombe Valley Day.
Coombe Valley Day. Now, what I have to say, in my defence, if my defence is necessary, is that this book was completed in March this year. So, in other words, sad to say, I got there first. Saturday was Coombe Valley Day, and Ankh-Morpork was full of trolls and dwarves, and you know what? The further trolls and dwarves got from the mountains, the more that bloody Coombe Valley mattered. These are the thoughts of Commander Sam Vimes of the police, by the way. The parades were okay. The watch had got good at keeping them apart, and anyway, they were in the morning when everyone was still mostly sober. But when the dwarf bars and the troll bars emptied in the evening, hell went for a stroll with its sleeves rolled up. In the bad old days, the watch would find business elsewhere, and turned up only when stewed tempers had run their course. Then they'd bring out the hurry-up wagon and arrest every troll and dwarf too drunk, dazed, or dead to move. It was simple. That was then. Now there were too many dwarves and trolls. No, mental correction. The city had been enriched by vibrant, growing communities of dwarves and trolls, and there was more, yes, call it venom in the air. Too much ancient politics, too many chips handed down from shoulder to shoulder, too much boozing too. And then, just when you thought it was as bad as it could be, up popped Grag Hamcrusher and his chums. Deep down dwarves, they were called. Dwarves as fundamental as the bedrock. they'd turned up a month ago, occupied some old house in Treacle Street, and had hired a bunch of local lads to open up the basements. They were Grags. Vimes knew just enough Dwarfish to know that Grag meant renowned master of Dwarfish lore. Ham Crusher, however, had mastered it in his own special way. He preached the superiority of dwarf over troll, and that the duty of every dwarf was to follow in the footsteps of their forefathers and remove troll kind from the face of the world. It was written in some holy book, apparently, so that made it okay, and probably compulsory. Young dwarves listened to him because he talked about history and destiny and all the other words that always got trotted out to put a gloss on murder. It was heady stuff, except that brains weren't involved. Malign idiots like him were the reason you saw dwarves walking around not just with the cultural battle axe, but heavy mail, chains, morning stars, broadswords, all the dumb, in-your-face swaggering that was known as clang. Trolls listened too. You saw more lichen, more clan graffiti, more body carving, and much, much bigger clubs being dragged around.
That's almost like a cross between Al-Qaeda and the 12th of July. I mean, it's about intolerance, and a lot of the book is about intolerance.
Yes, but I think the thing is, these are not particularly moored to one particular race or species or people or one particular moment in time. I'm not mapping any particular ethnic groups or religions onto dwarves and trolls.
But that's the great thing about setting something in Discworld. You don't have to.
No, but the point is they act as stupidly as human beings do, and no particular subset of human beings has a monopoly on stupidity.
What you mentioned Sam Vimes there. Sam Vimes is a character who has featured in other Discworld novels. Tell us a little bit about him and where he's come from, because he's the kind of strong centre of this book of Thud.
Yeah, he's not particularly clever. As he says, he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and in fact he sometimes fears that he may even be a spoon. But he's dogged, and he's painfully honest, and partly by accident and partly for other reasons, during the course of a number of the books, he has actually risen from more or less a drunk in the gutter to commander of the City Watch, and he's also now a duke, a hereditary, well, a non-hereditary post which goes with the post. But he's still at heart a street copper, and he still treats everything in terms of whether or not it's a crime. And he's a lot of fun to write for, because people who are slightly screwed up always are.
You have incredibly dedicated fans, and you have an internet site. You liaise with them on the internet. You're one of the first authors to do that. I mean, we've got, for example, a comment from one of your fans. Dave has been reading your books for many years, and he's in the middle of collecting all your signed first edition hardcovers. Given the number of books that you've actually written, that would probably be a life's work.
And quite expensive as well.
And I'd say quite expensive. But what does the internet tell you about your readers' favourite characters and stories and how you'd like things to go?
Well, you see, the internet isn't exactly a democracy. It's kind of lots and lots of people all shouting all at once, which maybe that is what a democracy is. I mean, everyone's got their favourite characters, and everyone wants to see more of that character, and everyone disagrees with the next person to post online, and so it's great to see and to get some insight in what people are looking for, but you know, there's only one person there when the screen is blank and the cursor is winking, and that's me, so I have to decide what happens next.
And are there Terry Pratchett or Discworld conventions, just as there are Star Trek conventions?
Yes, there are indeed, and remarkably nice things as well, I have to say. It's kind of strange. Someone did some research. I mean, people are always doing PhDs on me. And well, not on me, obviously on paper, but about me and about my readers and that kind of thing. And they found, to my mild surprise, that my readership is 60% women over the age of 25. This is not something I would have determined, although I think one of my oldest readers is in fact a Carmelite monk. Sorry, monk, no, a Carmelite nun.
Nun, right.
Yes, probably not a monk.
And who are you writing for? I mean, I presume you're writing for yourself, but I mean, what age group do you think, or did you think before this PhD research was your readership?
I think I started off kind of writing for myself. I mean, we were talking a lot about newspaper journalism, and you learn as a journalist that a word that isn't read is a word that hasn't finished being written. The whole point of what you're writing is its publication, and people are going to read it on Friday or Tuesday or every morning or whatever, and if they don't read it, you may as well have not written it. Now, there are some books, and I've read a few, which are written to be written. Discworld is written to be read. I started off with what would be the kind of book that I would like to read, and I suppose it sort of evolved from there.
And how do I get to be, if I wanted to be a character in one of your novels, or at least my name to be a character, I can do that. I can buy my way into the Discworld series.
Not necessarily.
No?
What you're referring to there is a process called Tuckerization, which, in common with some other authors, I must say, it's not unique to me. I have introduced to the country. It's more common in America. For a certain sum of money, and it's usually done at an auction for charity, you can become a minor character in a book. And sometimes they have some, and I try and write the right kind of character for the person. They use their own name. And
can they specify what they want? They want to be a good guy, a bad guy?
No, you can't. No, you
absolutely
cannot. No. There are actually rules that have been laid down for this, because it would be so easy for an author to get sued, wouldn't it? No, they put themselves in your hands. But on the other hand, people that want to be a Discworld character pretty much know what my mind is going to work like, and they're going to be quite happy to go along with it. And anyhow, I talk to them, and maybe they're friends, and have a look at them and have a think and see what their job is, and they get in, and they might only say a few lines, but they probably are not going to be a major character, but they have a lot of fun. I mean, if you want to know how much it costs, the answer is thousands of pounds.
Right.
Because
so
there's
out of my reach.
£2,200, I think, was the highest that was paid.
Right. Another comment from one of your fans who says, Declan Finley says that Monstrous Regiment is an excellent anti-war book, and Discworld is a wonderful invention in that Terry is not limited to one genre, and he says keep up the good work. Your fans ensured that you were equal with Charles Dickens. You finished a level with Charles Dickens in the BBC Big Read. That must have been, that was quite flattering, isn't it?
It was actually rather strange, because I would not have ranked myself with Charles Dickens, but it was what happens when people vote. I did have a T-shirt made which sort of said, I think it said less dead than Dickens, which I wore for a few days. It was kind of heartwarming, obviously, but it was just a thing that happened, a kind of publicity thing that was being done. I didn't let it go to my head. Can I talk a moment about genre?
Please. Yeah.
We set too much score by perhaps the look of things. Discworld is a fantasy, absolutely a fantasy, and I'll always call it a fantasy. But Thud, for example, minus a few sort of magical elements, is a political thriller. It's a cop novel, and I've written other books which are war novels, even possibly a romance, but because they've been set in a fantasy universe, even if it is a remarkably familiar one in some ways, they will be called fantasy books. I have no objection to this, but you can mix and match the fantasies and produce hybrids which can be quite interesting.
I presume that's what Declan Finley there, your reader, was getting at. You were involved in a spat over one of these newspaper spats over J.K. Rowling, not actually with, I think, J.K. Rowling, but tell me how that happened.
Oh dear. Someone interviewing J.K. Rowling wrote in an article, and there was no spat or spit or swipe involved. Good newspaper words, those. But off their own bat, they said effectively that before J.K. Rowling, fantasy writing largely consisted of lords and ladies Morris dancing to Greensleeves. And I read at that and wrote a snappy reply to the newspaper, because you have to think in terms of people like John Masefield, Ursula Le Guin, E. Nesbit. I mean, you can Jane Yolen. I mean, I can sit here and think of dozens and dozens of really incredibly good fantasy writers, and there's no Morris dancing, and there's no Greensleeves, and there's no lords and ladies. It is a remarkably inventive genre and can often be quite edgy in the things it tackles. And to see it dismissed like that.
Johnny come lately.
No. I mean, this wasn't J.K. Rowling saying it. This was someone saying it, if you like, to suggest that she had kind of completely revitalised a moribund genre. And in fact, you only have to look on the fantasy shelves in a bookshop to see they're pretty well crowded, and they must be making money for somebody. And then, because the words J.K. Rowling and Terry Pratchett were, as it were, linked together by some rather clumsy reporting, I thought, of the situation on the BBC website. Suddenly, for a few days, I was getting a lot of interesting emails. You know, it was kind of Pratchett slams Rowling, or was it Pratchett swipe at Rowling? There was a fracas, which is another newspaper term. Whereas, you know, I have got no problem with her at all, but as it were, endeavouring to elevate her by suggesting that everything that had gone before was mild and unimaginative and not very interesting seemed to me to be going too far.
Well, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking, and thank you very much for the Discworld series, which is very, very funny and also, I mean, very interesting in ways in which it is not just good, clean fun. Terry Pratchett, pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And Thud by Terry Pratchett is published by Doubleday and priced at €20. Terry Pratchett will be signing copies of Thud at Eason's in O'Connell Street in Dublin at 4:30 tomorrow afternoon, and doubtless he will be wearing the characteristic hat for which he is famous. Today's Rattlebag, produced by Sean O'Gorman. Tom Nolan was on sound. We're going to have Bell X1 in studio tomorrow. Until then, from all of us on Rattlebag, bye-bye.
With the darker autumn evenings, there's one group of people whose business is brightening up. Burglars.
By installing an Aircom Phone Watch 24-hour monitored wire-free alarm system, you get all year-round protection for your home. Order before Friday, October 28th, and get €200 off and don't pay a cent till spring. Call Phone Watch for a free quote on 1850 500 900. That's 1850 500 900. Aircom Phone Watch. Securing, monitoring, responding. Terms and conditions apply.
How's it going, lad? Fish and chips, is it?
All right, Sean. I'll have Maru, en robe de patty de frire, potatoes pont neuf, and a mousseline de petit pois.
And I'll have carrot, une portion de pommes pont neuf, grand, and chuck in enough, Master Dan Duvernay.
1 cod and batter, chips, mushy peas, 1 place large chips and a pickled egg. Ouvert ou en papier?
Wrap, please, Sean.
Harvey Nichols Restaurant, now open for lunch and dinner in Dundrum, Dublin.
Phil Coulter in a unique evening of songs and songwriters with Mick Hanley and Barry Mason. National Concert Hall, October 28th. Tickets from €20 including fees.
Zerif Killinti noch der Radio Heen award Hanere. Gaan ocht aan de hardcourt in bedrijf Joseph Finnegan. Tuiskis de man Hammersaide fi gas segur duchem la clia aronie. Daar een bref Patrick Brady den atawrne Ivan Banbury en goorte ágáil linn play riartas Bani. Dus een bref Finnegan nach flistrofi per bref agus slídor a vir bonegasan maradorú duiski ádihe. Ní wain le séine dus een bref Finnegan ach chód an cosantor sa gás a hira. Sa bíh chórs chaidir a maidin gar a pisan sí le